Hi, y'all. Andrew Mack here, and this is Loblolly Press in Conversation. A couple of announcements before we dive in. We're so happy to announce a collaboration with Good Printed Things out of Greenville, South Carolina. Together, we'll be publishing a field guide to North American trees by Garrett Ashley. Through a series of unique poetic forms, mirroring the way in which a field guide might describe trees, this small collection of poems reveals a green world that is as much a mirror to ourselves as it is a thriving ecosystem. We're so excited. It'll be available everywhere October 7th, so please sign up here on Substack or on our website for updates and events, where you can even come see Garrett in person. One more thing, we're officially 2 months away from the launch of The Computer Room by Emma Ensley. We've been working on this for so long, and we're so excited to publish our first collection of short stories from a writer based here in Asheville. If you haven't pre-ordered your copy, now is the time. Pre-orders receive the book before the debut date, and it helps us continue to support a thriving community of writers here at Loblolly Press. Today's guest on the podcast is Robert Busby. He's the winner of the C. Michael Curtis Short Story Book Prize and author of Bodock, his debut short story collection from Hub City Press. Robert grew up in Mississippi and lives now in Memphis, Tennessee. In our conversation, we talk about what it means to be a Southern writer, how masculinity is defined here and elsewhere, and how the South has always, but especially now, been a microcosm for larger political and social movements in the U.S. Let's get into it.
Fraternal Twins was one of the first stories I wrote post-graduate school. And so I did a lot of my writing, I feel like, here in Memphis, sort of in a vacuum. I haven't had a really strong writing community. So that's one of those stories that I don't think ever saw an editor, was never in a workshop setting or anything like that. So it's interesting for sure to hear feedback about some of these stories that didn't have a reader except for whoever the editor was who ended up accepting the story, or even the ones who rejected it, I guess, right? They read the whole story for sure before they reject. But but yeah, so so that one and some other ones as well, Steer Away from That Darkness, that was a post MFA story. And Heartworms was another one, which is also this sort of this commentary, I guess, or experiment in masculinity, as well.
Did you set out when you were starting as a writer to be a Southern writer, or is that a label that you've taken on now?
I think so. As in, at least in so much that once I became aware of regional labels in writing, obviously I wasn't thinking about that when I was writing a story about a boy who finds a rock from outer space and has to help get that rock back to its home in this sort of ET-esque this is a little short story that I wrote when I was in first or second grade. And so I wasn't thinking about oh, I'm a Southern writer then, or when I was writing ripoffs of Batman and Wolverine comics and middle school, or hard stories and high school. But I think once I got to college and I tried to write some of my early stories, I did try to write in other places. I lived in Colorado for a summer and tried to write a story there. And tried to write some stories that didn't have a very firm, was firmly rooted in a setting of any sort, at least outside of the immediate setting. I think I wrote a story about a bank robbery or something once, but it's not it was in the bank, pretty much. So but I think even when I was writing those stories, most of the writers that I aspired to and wanted to emulate were Southern writers for the most part. And eventually like just made my way to like writing about uh what would eventually become Bodock, which was just a fictionalized version of my hometown in North Mississippi. Um, and I wear that badge proudly. Like when anyone calls me a Southern writer, I'm like, all right, yeah, that's what I like set out to do. I set out to write about this place in the South. And if you're including me in that tradition of Lewis Norton and Flannery O'Connor and Brad Watson and Ellen Douglas and um Bobby Ann Mason, Jasmine Ward, like if you're going to put me like in that company, like I'm not going to complain. And I would even say like that was probably my intention anyway. It was like I wanted to be a Southern writer. I didn't want to write nothing against the Midwest. I lived in Chicago for like a winter. And so like that's the extent of my knowledge there. I wanted to write about this place that I knew that seemed like really foreign to the outside world as well. Like I went to grad school in Miami and Miami is such a like I loved living in Miami, but I was definitely like people were fascinated with my story, at least the friends that I had and stuff like that, like hearing about the exploits of growing up in a small town in Mississippi was definitely foreign to them. So yeah, I'm proud to be a Southern writer. I'll take that. Yeah.
I think there's also just so many there's so many ways to be a Southern writer, and you get at that with kind of the list of writers that sound like are your influences. But it's way different to be a Southern writer in Miami than it is to be in Mississippi, or where I'm at in North Carolina. Western North Carolina has its own regional writing tradition, and I think historically those have not been seen as equal in quality as quote unquote literature. And what I've loved about I think recent decades is just acknowledging kind of the output that we've had as a region, being one of the most productive places to write, and yet not getting the same recognition has been, I think, it has inspired me, and I feel it in other writers that I've talked to keep pushing for that. And I think that's what your work does, and Hub City, your publisher, it's what their work has, I think, been a large foundation for, especially in the area of the South that I'm in, and been a big inspiration for me coming out of South Carolina, like learning that there was Hub City Press, learning about the writers that I adored and were being published there, realizing, oh, there's room for me too within that world. It's super important.
Yeah. No, you bring up like a really good point. Yeah, there are a lot of states in the South. There are a lot of ways to write about the South. There's a lot of nuance within all of those different like subregions in the South. And yeah, like Appalachia, I mean, like and then even just the Carolinas. I mean, like George Singleton, Ron Rash, uh, and Pancake, like, there's a rich tradition like there that, like, I mean, I'm from Mississippi, and I do think that like that's sort of like a lot of times where a lot of that focus when you talk about Southern fiction like comes from. But like, yeah, even in Miami, like there was I read and became a big fan of Anna Menendez. She wrote this like collection of stories called "In Cuba Was a German Shepherd," and like it was like that should be included in Southern fiction as much as anything else, simply because like, I mean, it's in Miami, it's in Florida, that's a Southern state. I like claiming Miami. I feel like Like it's a wonderful town. And I loved living there. Such a great experience. And great writers, coming out of Miami.
It sounds like you've got quite a lot of inspiration coming in. Is there one writer in particular that you felt like made you feel like, oh, this is kind of what I want to do? I know that I want to do this as a writer.
It was Larry Brown's Dirty Work, which I feel like since in like the last like year, I have like noticed that novel specifically by Larry Brown being mentioned by a lot of other writers as being like this sort of like pivotal work in their own journeys to becoming a writer. And mine specifically was so I was in college and was just kind of like I was thinking seriously about what do I mean, like every, like, I guess, like college student at some point or any human at any point, it's like, what am I going to do with my life? I have to decide this now. I'm 20. I'm running out of time. And, but I mean, like, I was like, I only get, if I'm going to like study something here, what is it that, that I really want to be studying? And my entire life has been, it has revolved around, writing in some way. Like, it is the one thing that I think that like I was always sort of like naturally gifted at. And
you've been doing it since you were young?
Yeah, like I wrote a lot, like just probably in the same way that a lot of writers do. Like you just like come up with stories, and like I said, like drawing comics, things like that, like killing time in class.
The first thing I remember really writing was I decided that I was just gonna copy Junie B. Jones. I was gonna actually by hand copy that work, and I was like, I'm a writer now.
I can't remember who it was. I don't know if it was like Harry Crews or someone like that, but like did that same thing with Faulkner, but like in a serious like attempt at like trying to figure out like how to structure and plot out like stories, like writing paragraphs, how to do that. So it's funny, that like and maybe that's just it's a natural like tendency for writers, inclination.
It's one way we learn, right? I think writers process the world differently when they write versus when they read. I love to read, but I don't think about the world while I read. But when I write, I'm really actually ingesting and processing information. It comes in and it goes out,
No, I think to that point, I don't really know all the time what I think about something, or what my belief system is or something like that until I write about it. And it's in like the process, I think, like of revision where I'm challenging myself, but then also like trying to articulate exactly like what I think about a particular subject, which I feel like I do a lot, in fiction, in telling stories. I'm a lot of the things that the characters grapple with, like in stories, or what I'm grappling with. And it might be political, it might be existential. But like that's sort of like how and I think a lot of writers, like how they process the world, but then also like process their thoughts, their belief systems. It's like through that process of revision. It's like once I have it like written exactly as I intended to have it written, it's like, that's what I thought. Like that's how I think, or how I wanted to think. I had to like work through that to get to that articulation. But I feel like I definitely know more about topics and know more about myself when I've written about like those things that that I'm curious about or struggling with or whatever. But yeah.
Are you a researcher when you write, or do you write first and then come to the research? What's your process like?
I think it just depends. If I feel like it's something that is pretty near to my experience, like I'll jump right in and start writing. If, for instance, I've never been I've never been I've never been a detective, nor have I ever been a drug mule or anything like that. So like I've never transported uh illegal drugs. Well, at one time in Mississippi, like you couldn't get alcohol above like 5% like alcohol content. So there was some like going to Memphis and like stocking up on like good beer and bootlegging it back to Mississippi. Um I grew up in a dry county as well, and it wasn't until 2014 that you could like buy alcohol or even transport it legally like through the county.
Well, and there's still liquor laws on the books that prevent you from buying alcohol on Sundays. And I think people don't realize how regulated alcohol is in the South. And yet it's something that comes up in your stories a lot. I think people drink in your stories a lot. And I'm curious how, do you think that's part of the culture of growing up in the South, that it's something that you grapple with and you think about a lot?
Well, I had like part of that, yeah, is growing up just like where I grew up. And like if make something like, oh, you can't. I mean, not that I was like old enough to buy alcohol anywhere when I was still living in my hometown, because I wasn't 21. But it makes it, like if you make something taboo in that way, like it's like, oh, now I'm gonna try this. Like now I want to, I'm going after that 6-pack or 12-pack or suitcase of beer or whatever at the county line. But also like, I mean, there was my parents do not drink at all. Like we never had, actually the only alcohol we ever had in our house, like growing up, was when, we, I think we went to like a wedding in our neighborhood, and they had lots of like champagne and stuff like left over. And like, I think my mom felt like forced to take it. I don't know why she didn't throw it away. She just kept it like in the refrigerator. Uh, but there'll be a use for it. There's also that, right? Like we hold on to things because we're like, that might come in handy at some point. I might need a bottle of, cheap champagne, at some point. And but also like there were a lot of like in my like not my immediate family, my larger family, um there was a lot of drinking and alcoholism as well, or like borderline like alcoholism, whatever that means. But there were struggles like with it, and so there was a lot of like and hiding it. And like I mean um my grandmother was not an alcoholic, but I remember her like hiding, always having like a 6-pack of Old Milwaukee in a drawer of her refrigerator. And she didn't keep it like out in the open because it was just like, and I think there may be also this sort of like, I don't want people to know that like I like to enjoy, an adult beverage, or something like that. Um, and so, yeah. And then like, so yeah, I grew up sort of like around like that culture. Um and I don't know, maybe there's just, it's just a tradition, that's like one tradition in one type of Southern fiction is there's a lot of a consuming of alcoholic beverages. And so
Well, and that's why I was asking about it, because to circle back to Larry Brown, who I do think is I think he's a person that people look to. He wrote in the 90s. He wrote, that kind of like man's man fiction and whatever you want that to mean. I think he has a lot of men who are like messed up, and they're alcoholics and they're driving drunk and they're caught up in all these violent situations. What I thought was interesting about, the influence of him on your work is that the kind of disregard for others that I think some of his characters have, maybe that kind of like fantastical kind of grit that they have, seems to be slightly softened. And I say that not as in like the people are any less actually gritty. It's that there's a more complex version of them on the page. I think of steer away from that darkness when Bradley is he feels almost like this person you want to love, and at the same time it's like you're rooting for him, and you're also you want to hit him because you're like you have got to get it together. Like you have all this potential, and the thing that gets him right in the end of that story, not to spoil it for anyone, is this one decision around alcohol that kind of derails everything for him. I think what I'm trying to say is I see that lineage of the same kind of tradition of alcohol and of men, and masculinity and how that's represented, but I do see a different version of it in what you write. I wanted to know if that is intentional, if or if it's just something you feel like comes out of the way that you are in the world.
Um, I don't know if it's I don't know if it's intentional necessarily. I uh I mean, definitely like Larry Brown, like I said, was an early influence, and it was on the balcony of Square Books in Oxford when I like devoured dirty work in like a single setting, and decided like right then, in my um so like Damascus Road or something like moment, I was like, oh, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna devote my life to writing. But I may be butchering that. I grew up Southern Baptist. I know a lot of like Bible stories, but that may not have been the right reference there. Uh, but and just to clarify, I'm not still Southern Baptist. I left that denomination a long, long time ago. But
No, you're correct. It's seems like that's the place where Saul
yeah,
has a transformative encounter with
comes
Jesus.
yeah,
Revelation.
fine for a certain extended time, I believe, and becomes Paul. Yeah. So anyway, I I don't think that it's intentional. I think it probably like just has to do with uh my particular experience growing up, which is different than Larry Brown's, and my adult life is different from Larry Brown's, and if anything, I guess like I should also mention like Brad Watson is a really big influence, and I think that he quickly became like probably a replacement. Like Larry Brown was like the entry point, but Brad Watson was a writer in residence he had the Grisham writer in residence at the University of Mississippi from 2004 to 2005. And I remember like meeting him, and I had just started reading Last Days of the Dogmen, and Heaven and Mercury. And I think that he does like he treads that line like really, really well between this sort of like gritty landscape, but there's a sensitivity to his characters. And he writes, he's a very versatile writer. I think he writes women like really, really well. And I think like once I discovered for myself, like Brad Watson, like that was sort of like, that was kind of, and other writers as well, but that was sort of like, oh, you don't have to write in this hyper masculine like mode to be a Southern writer, to be a grit lit Southern like sort of writer. Like you can, there is a way to impart empathy and sensitivity like on your, not that Larry Brown like doesn't do that, he just does it like in a different way, but
I don't know if he always does it. Like
yeah, I didn't mean to. Yeah, no, I don't think that it's necessarily the mode that he's like working in, always. But yeah, and I don't know. I probably saw like some of Bradley, like some of myself, like in Bradley as well, because like sometimes when you're in a small town like that, you worry about like one of the big anxieties when you want to leave, and get out and see the rest of the world is like, how like will I be able to to do that? And my circumstances, I was like much more privileged than Bradley like was, and so he has a harder time of it and has to make like decisions that are morally suspect to get out. but I think like that also just that speaks to um like the working class, the middle class, the lower, like in this like country, like it is really difficult to get ahead. And I think that if you don't, you know, grow up with if you don't grow up with certain, or if you do grow up with certain privileges, it's difficult for you to appreciate like how far ahead of the field, like you're starting on the 50-yard line as opposed to the back of the end zone, like sort of thing. And I think that's where, but some of that anxiety of Bradley's of like, I want to get out, but I don't know if I can. I want to escape. I want to do something better, but I'm having to do this terrible thing.
Yeah, well, he does, right? He has to essentially be a criminal and put away money and in order to try to escape the town.
And that's a long tradition of like, I mean, I'm a big drive-by truckers fan, and so like that probably had some influence, like um putting people on the moon from their Dirty South album, where that character like sort of has to do some similar things to just make a living for his family.
If you're loving what you're hearing, please consider becoming a paid subscriber over at Loblolly Press on Substack. Your support helps us keep sharing the voices of Southern writers you might not hear anywhere else, and it goes directly toward the books, the podcast, and the writers behind them. Subscriptions start at $5 a month or $51 a year. Benefits include early access to pre-order, exclusive podcast episodes, and maybe best in this economy, 10% off all books and merch at loblollypress.com. You might already be here, but if you're on another podcast platform, you can find us at loblollypress.substack.com. Back to the episode.
Could we drill down on that kind of I'm curious to hear from you. You know, you mentioned as we were talking earlier about being kind of a sensitive person growing up in the South and how that level of vulnerability with others, especially as a kid, especially as a maybe as a boy growing up in the South, is difficult. And it feeds into that kind of idea of masculinity, right? Where we have to put on a version of masculinity that's acceptable to everyone around us. And I'm wondering if you feel like that comes through in your writing of these characters at all.
I mean, I do think there's I'm trying to like go back and think about some of the characters, you know, in
Like
this
what about our two boys in
Fraternal Twins. Is that what?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, in Fraternal Twins. We have eh, if you wouldn't mind just sharing kind of a general overview of what the story is and why it's relevant.
Yeah. So, well, in that story, and this, I think that this is probably a really good example of that. Like the beginning of that story is one of the brothers, the older and like physically like larger of the fraternal twins, shoots a mockingbird off of a power line with a pellet gun. And this is from that particular story, like that is the nugget of like true life. I actually did that. And yeah, so I have a younger brother. He's not a fraternal twin, but I made them fraternal twins in the story because I wanted them to be as close in age as possible. And I was messing around with my younger brother and was had a pellet gun and was acting like I was going to shoot this mockingbird on power line. And it was really just to to mess around with my brother in the way that siblings do. And I made the mistake of like I wasn't taking into consideration like the distance and then like how little power like a pellet gun like actually has. And so the trajectory, I'd aimed above the mockingbird, I thought a safe enough distance just to make my brother think that like, oh, I'm really going to shoot this bird. And so then when I pulled the trigger, and it's almost like in my mind's eye now, I can see the trajectory of that pellet. And then I saw the bird fall and felt absolutely like terrible about that. Um, and but there is like there's um and so in that story, I guess, like, there's a lot going on with, as you said, like masculinity and cosplaying like masculinity, and the boys are, yeah, coming of age, and they're at odds with, with each other. And like when the younger brother like develops this ability to hear animals in proximity who are like dying, like after deal, like I don't know, like it's just that's the nature, the laws of like this particular story. And he like suffers through that, and his brother's like very uh is very selfish, and like, you're gonna get us in trouble, like I'm gonna get caught for doing this, like that's his perspective at the beginning of that story. And then eventually, comes around, not to get like really specific, but like finding a way that he um can can help his brother. And there's also like there's a lot of references to, there's like this uh like conflict also between like superheroes and biblical figures that they're like sort of like trying to parse out or deconstruct like themselves, like um which so yeah, so that's going on. And yeah, I think that like these are two kids who, they've got a father who is pretty like absent, like he's present but he's absent, and doesn't like take things like very seriously, and does have like very uh like, I guess you would call um tradition, what we would consider, I guess, like traditionally like masculine responses like to some of the things they do. So when he finds out that like his son shot, Mockingbird, he does not share the wife's like sentiment of like, this was a terrible thing to do. He was like, how far away was it? That's an impressive shot, like that sort of thing. And so there's some of that, as well as like what like gets valued, in terms of
Yeah, or the father's saying like, I don't want to talk about school with the kids. Like he doesn't want to hear about what they're doing and learning. There's part of that kind of toxic masculinity that education is a bad thing. So I see it kind of pulsing through that story.
yeah. But no, you're absolutely right too, like this sort of like anti-intellectualism, I guess, as well, which was not what I was like. I did not go into that scene like, I am going to make this person a symbol for um this sort of macho anti-intellectualism. But really, right, but I was just writing like, I have seen other people like do this before. This is like what a lot of us men do in the South is we we do trivialize um academics and intellectual pursuits and things like that, for whatever gets replaced, whatever replaces that. Yeah.
I think it's the part of the experience of writing though is that that's why it's great to go back and look at it together, maybe even with another person, or hear kind of how your readers are experiencing it, because we can talk about those things that come out that you probably didn't put there on purpose, but that each of your characters start to serve, depending on who's reading it, certain ideas. And those ideas, then those are the things that get transferred down to the people who are going to continue to read your work. I wonder if it might be good to have you actually read some.
If I start with Nathan Pump the Lever on the gun. Okay. Okay. All right. Nathan pumped the lever on the gun several times to deposit power into the rifle. before overstating the sight's distance above the bird. Both the rifle and the revolver were Christmas gifts. A month's worth of practice could be assessed in the remnants of plastic Coke bottles and sandcastle molds blown up and scattered across the yard. But those had all been near targets, 20 feet at best. The gun's trajectory at this range was one unfamiliar to Nathan. He was as surprised as Nicholas when he pulled the trigger and the bird dropped in slow suspension from the power line. "Holy shit," Nicholas said. "You killed it." "No, I didn't." "You're going to hell." "It ain't dead," Nathan insisted, but he was quite damn sure the bird had expired. Then a wing fluttered. Nathan's heart mimicked the gesture. Both brothers waited for the bird to take flight, to soar away in some miracle they had only ever read about in the Bible, Moses parting the Red Sea, or the ascent of Elijah, Jesus raising first Lazarus and then himself from the dead. Nathan mouthed a prayer for just such a miracle, but the bird's flight was restricted to some grotesque flopping, a one-legged ballerina pirouetting to the refuge of an oak leaf hydrangea in the middle of the yard. When the boys reached the bush, the bird was cowering aggressively amongst the shadows of the lower branches. Nathan could feel his heart chipping away from itself like so many plastic Coke bottles. He was sure the bush was on the verge of ignition, that the veracity of God's voice would transform Nathan into a pillar of ash more easily digested by the earth. Instead, Nathan only heard the bird, but perhaps, too, that was the voice of God. He realized then the most impressive miracle was not that Jesus had conquered death, but that he had graduated from adolescence without ever having done anything terrible at all. Certainly not shooting a mockingbird or masturbating to fuzzy Cinemax sex. Nicholas, too, recognized innocence in front of him and knew he no longer belonged to it. He could have knocked Nathan's dick in the dirt 2 seconds ago, or any of the boys at school scratching like apes in front of Lacey in the cafeteria lunch line the week after the Martin Luther King holiday, before a lice inspection was conducted on the entire class. The boys picked at each other's scalps and mock ate what they found there as Lacey was escorted from Mrs. Dorsey's class an hour after the inspection. Nicholas made no move at any point to defend her, and now his cowardice and vanity had brought to tears 2 of God's creatures. The mockingbird's pleas were synonymous with the appeal Lacey's eyes made as they searched for some savior in the cafeteria. Her lunch tray, held between the bent, skinny wings of her arms, had quivered noticeably. Nicholas grabbed the revolver from Nathan's back pocket. "I should have stood up for Lacey," he said. Lacey? "I'm fixing to shoot you in the fucking forehead if you say that again." Nicholas motioned the handle of the gun at his brother. "You have to put it out of its misery. Maybe the vet can come do it." "You know Dr. Svensson's number?" "Mom does." "Exactly." "I can't do it." "Pussy," Nicholas said.
It's just there's so many nuggets in there like that we could spend a lot of time right on that one section. But I'm curious, as you read it now out loud, what are some of your reflections hearing yourself talk about it?
Well, yeah, there's also, there's the way that they talk between each other and the language that they use, which is using the feminine to criticize the masculine, as in like being some like inferior or something like that, which is a trait. It's a habit. It's an unfortunate habit of, like you said, these hyper masculine cultures. There's obviously they have spent a lot of time in church. There's some conflict there between, this. There's a lot of, he's thinking about like the similarities between the stories that he has heard and his inability to live up to like these impossible like mythologies that they get presented as truth to young kids who more or less in some ways like traumatized by that because they think like that's the way that I have to live. Um, there's there is this violence and not wanting to get caught. He's and also, but like this isn't masculine, but it's presented that way in some ways as like just taking responsibility for your actions, and Nathan can't do that. And he wants to try to get out of it and just like, well, let's just get the vet to do it. And Nicholas, like, who's going to call the vet? Mom. And like, you don't want mom to know that you did this, like that sort of thing. And so then Nicholas has to take this, into his own hands, even though he wasn't, at fault. But he's paying the price of the sins, I guess, like more or less of his brother, which is also like in some ways like very biblical. So there's a lot like going on.
I mean, it reads as a parable in some ways. I wrote next to the margins. I was like, margins, this is like a parable, really, because it teaches. It doesn't necessarily teach a lesson in the way a parable does, but it does kind of evoke that sort of Christian ideology while it's aware of itself, though. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think, and I was intentional with that. Like and you articulated it better than I could have, but like I definitely wasn't wrestling at the time with those things, but was like conjuring previous struggles, like with with a lot of growing up in a very sort of like fundamentalist religion. But I also think like at the same time, a lot of my stories, I do think like sort of like with Offerings, the very last like story in the collection, that was the very first Ice Storm story that I wrote. And it was supposed to be a standalone story. And I went into it as just like rewriting sort of the flood. And so like then the Ice Storm became the flood, and Noah became Noel in the story. The cabin that they had, the family cabin, small, modest cabin they have like out in the woods is the ark. And at one time in earlier versions of that, there was a strange collection, or not, just an odd collection of a random collection of like livestock that was out there, including a goat, which I had a goat growing up because my grandfather raised goats and llamas and things like that, and played a joke on us once and just like left one chained in our yard and was like, and then it becomes like, oh yeah, but what do we do with this now? I guess we have a pet goat. Like there's, like I don't think the animal shelter is gonna like take a goat. Yeah, so like I've got but those animals obviously they did not survive revisions, and so probably for the betterment of the story. But yeah, and then there was a story that was called Anglers of the Keep. They got renamed Parable of the Lung. And so I say that because like it was originally published in Mississippi Noir, which was a Tom Franklin like edited that anthology. And that was Kate at Hub City. It was like, we'd really like to like come up with a different name for this story. Which I was fine with and definitely agreed with their reasoning. But I was like, I don't know, like this thing has like lived with me for so long. I don't know like how I'm going to. And so I like shot off like a list of like 20 titles. And I was like, I need some help here. And so I think I'm trying to remember if like Parable of the Lung was on there or if it was like Parable of something else. And then Kate may have like said, what about Parable of the Lung? I can't remember, but like I was like, no, it's perfect. Because I do think there are so many of these stories that whether intentionally or not are rooted in like biblical mythology, because those were the first stories that I read.
I think a lot of people think that version of the South, the very hyper-religious, very conservative ideology, is all of us here. And so I'm wondering how you feel as a Southerner who grew up here, how that affects your writing and your view of the world.
If you grow up in a place like Mississippi or South Carolina or like almost anywhere in the South, what you're seeing like happening in the country right now is kind of like yeah, that has been like, that's been our identity for a really long time. And what we're seeing is that maybe that identity is shared like across the country, but we've been kind of the scapegoat, I guess, like for that. And so
For that racism,
yeah, for racism, the xenophobia, homophobia, all of that. Yeah, absolutely. And um I think that like you're writing about those things in poetry or fiction, novel, short stories. It's based like in the South, but like we've been writing about those things for a very long time, because that's been the reality of this region for a very long time. Um, I think it's been the reality of the country probably for a very long time, but we're just now seeing a lot of that like become this sort of like national identity, as opposed to, it's been easy for the rest of the country just to like say, oh, that's how people, like that's the political climate, the political identity like of the South.
Thank you for listening to Loblolly Press in Conversation. This episode was produced, edited, and mastered by me, Andrew Mack, from my home in Asheville, North Carolina. Loblolly Press is dedicated to amplifying emerging voices from the American South, with a focus on queer, BIPOC, and rural writers. To learn more about our books, our authors, and what's coming next, head to loblollypress.com and subscribe to our newsletter. You can also find us on Instagram at loblolly_press for updates, behind-the-scenes content, and a lot more. If you like this episode, please do consider leaving a review or sharing it with a friend. It really helps us keep going and supports the writers we believe in.